I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's 12 o'clock. I'm sure there'll be more folks joining us here as we move along. I want to welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so pleased that you could join us here. No matter how accustomed we have all become to doing everything on Zoom, there's still novelty in introducing the very first of our 2020 Talks at 12 series this way. One of the clear advantages is that we can so readily accommodate people from outside of Ithaca on Zoom as speakers and as participants, something we haven't been able to do before. So this means that I think this is likely to be our most well-attended Talk at 12 ever. And I think with Patrick here, it's the first one we've done remotely with a speaker. So there are multiple elements today that are new. Today's workshop is hosted by the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research, Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research, the BCTR for short. The BCTR research policy and practice, service of human development and well-being. Our Talks at 12 series, offered approximately once per month, is specifically intended to feature projects that speak to the unique ways in which science and practice or policy come together. Today's talk by Patrick Hill on retiring on purpose or for a purpose falls squarely within this nexus, and I think will speak to many of us participating today for professional and personal reasons. Before I pass it to Tony to introduce our speaker, I'd like to cover a few quick presentation logistics. We are using the Zoom webinar feature, which means that all of you are automatically muted and that none of us can see each other, only the speaker. This will help us limit distractions, as I know you are all aware can occur quite readily on Zoom. There will, however, be time at the end for questions and answers. Each of you can raise your hand by clicking the participant's icon at the bottom of your screen and then looking for the raised hand. When we get to the Q&A portion of today's talk, I will look for the raised hands, call on someone with a raised hand, and selectively unmute you so you can ask your question directly. You can also type your question into the chat function at any time during the presentation, and we'll be sure that your question is asked during the Q&A. If you have any questions about this process, please contact myself or Paula in the chat box privately, and we'll try to help you. Okay, now I'd like to turn it over to Tony. As some of you may know, Tony Burrows joined the BCTR recently as director. He brings with him a distinguished array of talents and colleagues, one of those being today's guest speaker. Again, thank you all for coming. I'm sure you'll enjoy today's presentation. Tony?
Awesome. Wonderful, and thank you, Janice. My name is Tony Burrow, and I serve as the director of the BCTR. It is my absolute honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Patrick Hill. Dr. Hill, or Pat as we know him, is joining us today from the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. There, he's also the director of the PATH Lab, which refers to Purpose, Aging, Transitions, and Health. True to form, Pat has studied each of these things and has done so extensively. Pat has well over 100 publications covering these topics, and within each of them presents some of the most innovative and exciting and really informative studies on the market. And so I think we're in for a treat today to get him to have him joining us today to talk about some of these wonderful topics. I know we don't have much time for the kind of introduction that I really want to give, but there are a couple of things I would like to mention before I hand it over to Pat. First, we are truly honored and lucky to have Pat joining us today. Pat was actually scheduled originally to give a talk at Cornell back in March of this year. He was going to join us in person to give a talk in the College of Human Ecology in the middle of March. We really were about 2 or 3 days away from his talk. He had his flights scheduled, his hotel booked. And then on the same day, I believe it was, both of our universities sent us emails and texts saying that the universities were shutting down and that we would be violating some policy if we actually went ahead with the talk. So we decided to cancel. But that also means that we're about 2 or 3 days away from Pat being a 5-month roommate of mine here in Ithaca. And I don't cook well enough for him to have enjoyed that very much. So we put a stop to it. And so we really are fortunate to have him talk to the BCTR today. And I just want to thank you, Pat, for agreeing to give a talk here again, even in a different modality and different format. We absolutely appreciate that you decided to again, and in many ways, it's kind of a return to normalcy to kind of pick up where we left off a little bit. I also just want to mention that I deeply appreciate Pat as a colleague and friend. We met back in our Notre Dame days. He was a graduate student and I was a postdoc. And since then, getting to work with him and observe his scholarship over the years, I can honestly say that I've learned as much, if not more, from him than anyone else when it comes to thinking about this concept of purpose in life. To watch what he's done with this concept, both in terms of what it means. I mean, the guy has his own measure of purpose, and to think about how he's understood or tried to understand the concept among different populations and in different contexts has really been informative and remarkable. It's truly among my most meaningful and personal and professional relationships. And so to get to learn from him throughout over the years has been remarkable, but to allow all of our friends and colleagues in this Brown for Better Center and beyond do the same today is just something I'm very much looking forward to. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to you, Pat, and please take it away.
Okay, well, after that introduction, there's absolutely no way I can live up to it whatsoever. So thanks for setting the bar really, really high, Tony. And what I'm going to do today is provide some of our ongoing work looking at a sense of purpose among older adults and, okay. Hopefully you can all now see my screen. So what I want to do is give this talk more as kind of a conversation. And for me, it's been likely more of an internal conversation for the last couple of years, in which, as Tony mentioned, we've been studying this construct of purpose for quite some time. And a lot of my work to this point has been really focused on this idea of, I don't want to say legitimizing purpose in scientific study, but showing that sense of purpose predicts a lot of valuable things that we'll get to later. And for me, taking this from kind of a very strictly empirical, quantitative perspective, we end up with this idea, this notion that, you know, we should be going around and trying to promote purpose in every way, shape, or form, trying to help retirees to feel purposeful in particular. And a real important point of my career was a couple years ago. I got to give a public lecture back when we were able to travel in the beautiful city of Zurich. There's gonna be lots of photos of my travels, mostly so I can remind myself that these places are still places I can go to eventually again. But this talk in Zurich was focused on a very similar topic as the one today. What I was describing was my decade plus of work showing sense of purpose seems to be predictive of several indicators of healthy aging, healthy development across the lifespan, particularly focused on older adulthood, that a lot of my work lately has been on promoting purpose research among gerontologists and individuals focused on retirement. And after spending an hour going slide after slide after slide, talking about all of these studies and the benefits of purpose, the very first question I got at this talk in Zurich from a very prominent scholar, the first thing mentioned was, you know, I don't buy it. I just don't think we should be encouraging older adults to feel purposeful. Yeah, this just isn't a thing. And it was one of those moments where, you know, usually you're kind of struck by questions, but the audience was even kind of like, did you just like listen? Like he just spent an hour talking about this. And 2 years later, I can actually understand the question. And I think we're going to discuss today, there might be some credence or some value of considering this, specifically when trying to translate this research into application. So what I'm going to do today is kind of talk about my personal path through these questions, particularly focused on older adulthood and retirement. So we'll discuss a little bit about what sense of purpose is, how do we measure it, Then I'm going to provide evidence towards what I think are the two biggest reasons for thinking about interventions to promote a sense of purpose among older adults. And then this is kind of where the derailed part of my path plays out, that we're going to talk about 3 reasons, I don't know if you want to say to reconsider or to rethink interventions for promoting purposefulness in older adulthood. And these ideas, including that question that I just mentioned in Zurich, have really led me to have to be more thoughtful and more considerate of what is needed in order to translate our research program into practice in retirement communities and beyond. So that's where we will end today, is what is needed going forward. So let's start with what is purpose and what is a sense of purpose. So I want to bring up the fact that these are kind of 2 separate features, and most of the work you're going to see today is focused on sense of purpose. So to begin, a purpose in life is typically defined as kind of this overarching aim, this broader goal that you have for your life that defines where you're going, defines what your day-to-day activities are, helps you to define the self and be more engaged with your life. So as is indicated in my lab acronym, what we usually think of it as is your path. What is your path, your direction for life? And here's one path that I was walking on in Hawaii way back when, to give you kind of that sense of directedness from one day, one step to the next. So that is an important distinction here between purpose in life and sense of purpose, insofar that one's purpose in life can be particularly difficult to measure or capture. Because a lot of us, myself included, cannot really articulate fully what that purpose in life may be, even if we may feel that we have one. And B, it leads to great difficulties for researchers in terms of every single person may have a slightly different purpose in life. So this is something we're going to come back to later with intervention. But for now, I'm going to focus on sense of purpose. And to give you an idea of what this construct looks like, here are a few of the items from the most well-known inventory of sense of purpose used in literature. So the work of Carol Riff developed a scale that asks individuals to report their agreement to all these different items, with higher levels of purpose being indicated by rating greater agreement to things like you enjoy making plans for the future and working to make them a reality. Lower levels of purpose being indicated if you rate a lot of agreement to my daily activities often seem trivial and unimportant. And ultimately what we're getting at here is some idea of the sense or the feeling that you have that there is a direction to your life, that there is something guiding you towards more meaningful personal activity, greater life engagement overall, and kind of setting plans for the future. And when we think about this future orientation piece, this is where things really directed my work towards older adulthood. And one of the reasons why I think it's really essential for us to consider older adulthood is that this sense that you have a path can decline with age. So if you're thinking of building an intervention or building programs to help individuals, one of the first things that you want to consider is, is the need there? And I think the need is going to be clearly shown through a couple of studies. So first off, just to pay homage to one of the first investigations on the topic, Carol Riff and Corey Keyes asked younger, middle, and older adults to report on different measures of well-being. And as a lot of the aging and gerontology researchers in the audience know, one of the common findings is that, counter to perhaps popular wisdom or popular belief, A lot of well-being constructs show great continuity into older adulthood, that this may run against the common perception that older adulthood and retirement may be periods of decline or loss. In fact, we tend to see a lot of indication that individuals are relatively maintaining similar scores. And I'm not going to bring up these other dimensions of well-being today, but you can see a lot of these lines are staying fairly flat, and a lot of other studies have shown this using more rigorous methodologies. But the one line that I want to point to today is this one in purple. The one construct that Riff and Keyes were looking at that shows pretty stark declines, or that I should say older adults were reporting much lower scores on, is sense of purpose. Meta-analytic work on this topic has also shown that older age and even retirement status both provide risk factors for feeling a greater sense of purpose. There's a recent study even out, I got a Google Scholar alert this morning about another study showing that age seems to be older age seems to be negatively associated with a sense of purpose. And when you consider what we were saying about purposefulness, perhaps this is not that surprising in terms of a lot of those items were related to future orientation, enacting the goals and the plans that you have for yourself. But I also want to point out some of the work that we did asking people the same items over time. So that was a cross-sectional study, some of the early work just comparing older adults to adults at different points in the lifespan. Some of our more recent work has made use of this really well-known data set housed by the University of Michigan, known as the Health and Retirement Study. We're going to talk about it a lot today and some of the implications for intervention. But what's great about this data set is around 2006, they started assessing sense of purpose every 4 years. So we now can look at the same participants, following them up over time just to see, there's a lot of reasons why cross-sectional age differences occur. I'm talking to the audience that I probably don't need to explain why developmentalists have looked at longitudinal data instead. But there's a lot of reasons why we need to consider following people up over time. And in this study, we followed individuals from 2006 to 2010, 2014, and examined their trajectories for sense of purpose. We did this using some sophisticated latent growth modeling, which I won't bring up today, but we're going to show you instead what I think really tells the story is a series of histograms, just plotting the average change score, or the change scores for each of the participants in the sample. So what you're going to see in a moment are a bunch of histograms showing each individual's change score across 4 different categories. And these 4 categories reflect the different working and retirement statuses. So the top left indicates individuals who reported having never worked. The top right indicates the change scores for people who were retired before 2006, the first assessment of purpose. The bottom left is individuals who retired during the 8 years we were following them up. And the bottom right were people who reported still being engaged in the workforce throughout. And to make this a little easier, these purple lines indicate no change. So what you're seeing pretty clearly is the fact that for most older adults in the sample, when we were following them up over time, most people are on the left side of these purple lines. That this is indicating for most older adults of the thousands that were investigated here, they were showing declines in sense of purpose with age at kind of within person change. And I want to blow up these last 2 to point out another important point, that working status also mattered. That for those individuals who were still in the workforce for the most part, what you're finding is this pretty peak distribution on the right where there's not a whole lot of change going on. Like most people are sticking around their same level of sense of purpose. Whereas for the individuals who retired during the study, you can see that the distribution is a lot wider. This was true for individuals who retired before as well. And what this is showing is, again, not only is older age a risk factor, but retirement itself seems to be particularly important. And that being said, what I want to point out here is, in addition to the fact that we might consider programs because people are at risk for decline, we also may want to consider programs because there's variability here. That if you look at this histogram on the left, it's the case that individuals are not all below the left line. For retired adults, there is a lot of variability in their change patterns, that some people are maintaining a sense of purpose into the post-working years, and some individuals are actually finding a greater sense of purpose in retirement. So this gives us a lot of hope when we're thinking about translating this into programs for promoting a sense of purpose among older adults, that not everybody is kind of doomed or in fact just set to decline. There's a lot of variability here, and that variability is important for building programs. So the other major reason why I want to think about interventions is this idea that sense of purpose is linked to a wide array of adult outcomes, a wide array of things that we think are important as aging and gerontology researchers. And I'm not going to go into a lot of this work today, but one way of trying to organize it is to consider the categories that were established or found for different definitions of successful aging by one review of the literature. So the first thing that, again, may not be something that I need to tell the BCTR audience is it's really important to note that successful aging and positive adult development is not simply the absence of declines or the lack of losses. That, in fact, as this review is showing, there's a lot of things here that we should be promoting. We should expect could show positives throughout the lifespan, and we shouldn't just be focused on the absence of illness, infirmity, or the absence of cognitive decline. And when you consider these different categories, what I want to bring up very quickly as a one-slide overview of a decade of work is we find sense of purpose predicts all of these things. That among older adult participants, among middle to older adult samples, we have shown time and time again that sense of purpose is predictive of greater life expectancy, greater physical health and functioning, greater well-being at the daily level, as well as long-term. So pretty much across the board, we're finding that sense of purpose seems to be valuable as a predictor correlate of healthy adult aging outcomes. And another important point when, again, considering changing someone's sense of purpose or trying to create programs to improve aging through targeting sense of purpose, is the fact that changes in sense of purpose also matter. So the studies that are bolded and italicized here, excuse me, are studies in which we have shown also that changes in sense of purpose either predict or coincide with changes on these outcomes of interest. So for instance, Emily Wilroth and I have a paper under review now that has shown across multiple samples that changes in purposefulness predict health outcomes later above and beyond how adults started their initial levels on purposefulness. Sarah Weston has demonstrated that changes in social support and social strain tend to coincide with changes in purposefulness. And now Dr. DeWitt has demonstrated that changes in sense of purpose coincide with changes in memory performance, as well as in changes in subjective memory performance. For gerontologists in the audience, you probably know that subjective memory is another important outcome to be considering, because individuals' memory beliefs often play a big role in what kinds of activities they're willing to take part in. And memory beliefs have been shown to predict later risk for non-normative decline above and beyond even objective performance. So this is kind of where that talk was in Zurich in a lot of ways, that we show a lot of these positive outcomes, a lot of indication that sense of purpose seems to matter. And my case would be that programs within retirement communities, programs for intervention, should consider targeting sense of purpose because it is susceptible to decline. There is still variability in people's patterns of change, and it seems to predict a lot of important things when we get to adult development. Now, with that all being said, and this is a particularly narcissistic slide in that I'm just going to show you a lot of my own references, but a lot of other people have shown these findings as well, which leads to the question of why is interventions for sense of purpose the path less traveled? To my knowledge, there really aren't that many studies out there. There's only a few major intervention programs for older adults that have kind of targeted sense of purpose. It seems to be something that, even though it has a lot of empirical evidence pointing towards its value, that older adult researchers, older adult programs have been hesitant to consider as a target. And here's where I want to bring up three things that have changed my thinking about how we should translate this work into practice. What we could do as researchers to connect this quantitative work to programs in retirement communities in some nuanced ways. The first thing I want to bring up is going back to the question that I was asked. I bring this up again because now I have a real appreciation for what the researcher was suggesting, that a lot of the work out there has focused on helping older adults to perhaps attend to shorter term goals, tangible goals, fixed goals that they can succeed in, and not being so focused on these big, broad future projects. With the idea that, a lot of scholars suggest a purpose in life is something that should never be fully obtained, and perhaps focusing individuals on that kind of a construct could be problematic. One reason for this is our ideas of older adulthood as kind of a period of compensation rather than new engagements and new directions. Another thing I want to bring up later is when we think about retirement, our conceptions of retirement may need to change to account for the changes in life expectancy. That these ideas of retirement that, even my parents hold are mostly focused on, say, retirement as a break or a rest. And when you consider that, it may not necessarily be that adaptive or that beneficial for people to be thinking about this big overarching thing like a purpose in life. And in fact, this is what we find in some of our work in retirement communities. So the second reason I really want to bring up here is this idea that retirees themselves may not really be expecting to focus on a purpose-driven life. So a few years ago, we went into a retirement community, a private continuing care facility, and interviewed older adults in the facility about what their purpose meant for them. We got kind of a really comprehensive portrayal of their purpose at different points of the lifespan. We asked them about their ability for goal-directed activities, what kinds of things could be done differently in the retirement community. And these were some really impactful, just a wealth of information in these interviews. Typically, people were taking at least an hour to talk to us. And of course, here we are coming in with these past findings I just showed you. We're thinking about purpose from the perspectives of empirical research, and we're ready to code for the themes for purpose that I started this talk off with. And what became very clear, as is often the case in qualitative work, is there were some themes that we had to throw into the paper as emergent, in the sense that things that we were not expecting to hear from our retirement community members that played a really important role in the interviews. And the one that, for us at least, was particularly troubling was this idea that almost half of the participants said something about purpose in life was not applicable to older adults, telling us that older adulthood is not necessarily a period in which they were so focused on this big goal for life. Some people directly said that was for younger individuals, that's not for us. To give you a flavor of some of the text here, we had people responding like, when you get to be our age, how much direction can you have? Or your purpose in life is waking up in the morning and remembering what day it is. And as a reminder, this was before COVID, when people could still remember what day it is, because I have a vague idea that I think today is Thursday, but beside that point, we need to recognize that there were a lot of participants bringing these kinds of themes up. And what was telling to us was, when we heard this, we as the researchers who have spent all this time promoting purpose, like, oh geez, this is a really troubling interview, this is a really troubling time. The participants did not seem to be worried. This was not something that was a conversation that was troubling the participants. And in fact, they loved talking to us, to the point that a lot of interviewers were invited to stick around after. It was like, oh, can you stay for tea or something after this? So as much as we were kind of troubled by this theme that purpose in life was not applicable, they were not. And it might be reflecting the fact that, again, these are individuals who may have been growing up at a time when the idea of retirement was more of a respite from the working life. The final thing I want to bring up here is that purpose in life may look different for retirees, or how we need to capture it may need to be different when we're looking at retired adults. And it's kind of an interesting mixture to throw three things together that's kind of anecdotal work, qualitative work, and now I'm going to show you measurement and variance work, which is on the complete opposite side of the spectrum. But going back to those change scores that I showed you at the start, we looked at how these items actually loaded onto a construct of purpose differently for people who were working versus retired. And what you find is that this scale was variant across working and retired adults. That these items, to put it differently, meant something different for retirees rather than adults still in the workforce, and were better or worse indicators of sense of purpose for individuals in the workforce versus retired. So for instance, the items in bold were ones that seemed to be stronger indicators of how purposeful people felt for individuals in the workforce. And these are all things that are kind of focused on this future orientation. Being an active person, focusing on carrying out plans in day-to-day life, making plans for the future. Versus the italicized and underscored item was something that was more indicative of sense of purpose for individuals who were retired. And what I think this is telling us, beyond just the idea that we need to come up with new ways of measuring purpose, is the notion that how we think about purpose needs to reflect the developmental context of the adult and the given situation, the given roles that somebody is experiencing at that stage of their lifespan. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about where this has left me. So we've spent all this time showing that sense of purpose is a valuable asset for older adults and predicts a lot of important outcomes in older adulthood and for retirees. And I should have mentioned at that time, one thing that I like to bring up is a lot of that work shows that sense of purpose plays a unique role. Like we've controlled for a lot of the other psychosocial constructs you might be interested in, like positive relations with others, personality traits, health, demographic variables. Sense of purpose seems to be uniquely beneficial across a wide array of things that also predict healthy aging. So given that it seems to have this unique benefit, where do we go from here in order to develop programs that can address some of these concerns that I just raised? I think the first thing that we need to bring up is the idea that purpose, as kind of a capital P purpose, is a daunting construct and something that might be problematic to try to infuse or to try to come into a retirement community talking about. And I can say this firsthand because the last time I was able to go into a retirement community to talk to residents, when I mentioned I was there to talk about purpose in life, immediately there was kind of this tendency to shut down. They weren't really, it's like, I don't know about this, until we talked about how a purpose in life doesn't have to be something that is so big, important, and influential that it's affecting everybody in the world. That I think once you get people away from the idea that purposeful direction, purposeful activity needs to be a big, broad thing, you can start to have these conversations. And another way of going about this is creating interventions that aren't necessarily targeting purpose per se. So our best guess for a program thus far, based on our empirical work, is engaging older adults and retirees in more activities in daily life. So I'm going to talk about 3 different studies that provide some evidence for this claim. The first one goes back to that health and retirement study, in which my former graduate student, Nate Lewis, looked at 4 different types of activities: cognitive activities, physical activities, social activities, and what we were calling supportive activities, doing things for others for the most part. And again, individuals in that study were completing this measure and the measure of sense of purpose every 4 years. So we have 3 waves of assessment for these individuals. And the first thing to note is, in line with notions of purposeful living as active, engaged living, as something that provides someone with greater life engagement, higher scores on all of these were positively associated with higher scores on sense of purpose. Put differently, older adults who are engaging in any of these categories tended to report a higher sense of purpose in life. But one thing to bring up, which is really important for intervention and practice, is that none of these associations were terribly overwhelming. That they were all kind of what we would think of as moderate to small in magnitude. And what we believe this is showing is that, once again, everybody has a different purpose or direction for life. And we should not expect that any one activity is going to work for everybody. That cognitive activities may be very valuable for my daily sense of purpose, given my occupation, whereas physical activities may be more valuable for somebody else's sense of purpose. So what we then did, with the recognition that none of these activities were necessarily any more or less valuable than the others, is if you look then at total activity engagement, we can look at activity engagement changes within a person and total activity between people. So it's a question of, first, how much I change in activity engagement over the years and how that relates to a sense of purpose, or how much I differ in activity engagement from the other people in the sample. And what we find is both of these things matter. That total activity engagement was a consistent predictor, and we were controlling for everything under the moon again, but is a consistent predictor of changes in sense of purpose over time in this sample. Greater activity was linked to feeling more purposeful, or at least maintaining a sense of purpose, because again, more participants than not were declining in that sample. But what's really important is we find evidence that activity engagement may matter more for retirees. So this is kind of a modest effect, admittedly, but what you find is that for retired adults, who were the solid black line here, the fact that there is a greater kind of slope here indicates the fact that greater change in activity engagement is linked to greater change in purpose for retirees rather than individuals who are not retired. So we find that not only is activity engagement important for increasing sense of purpose, but it seems to be even more important for retirees than it does other individuals in older adulthood. The next study I want to bring up was conducted as a senior thesis by my great former thesis student, Rachel Best. That Rachel employed some of the data that we've been collecting as part of the Hawaii longitudinal study of personality and health, in which sense of purpose was assessed twice, 2 years apart. And these were two pretty impactful years because for a lot of the participants in the sample, they reflected kind of that traditional period in which individuals start to retire or transition to retirement. So at wave one, participants were on average around 60, but ranged between 56 and 65 years of age. And then 2 years later, they were assessed again on their sense of purpose, as well as on their retirement status. So what Rachel was bringing to this story is the idea that retirement does mean something different nowadays. That most of you in the audience could probably think of individuals that don't fit well into a retired versus not category. This is no longer a 0 or a 1. That we need to start considering the fact that a lot of individuals are moving in and out of the workforce. The work of Dawn Carr at Florida State and others have shown that it's quite frequent for people to report being retired at one wave and not being retired at the next and working. So what Rachel was interested in was considering what it means to be partially retired, or whether this could be kind of a stepping stone for individuals to help stem that decline that seems to be present for retired versus working adults. And the first thing that she finds is, admittedly, these aren't huge differences. These are all mean scores for sense of purpose across the two waves. But what you find is, while the other groups are declining in the way that we would expect with age, partially retired adults are actually increasing on sense of purpose and direction. That the individuals who reported being kind of engaged in work, but maybe also kind of having new opportunities for engagement outside of work, were those who were feeling more purposeful in their lives. And getting back to activity engagement, she was able to look at a series of categories, and these are the correlations between activities and greater sense of purpose. Again, all the correlations are positive, but what I want to point out is the fact that this purple column shows the correlations for the partially retired group. Mind you, I'm going to be scientific and point out that there is the caveat, we only have 66 people here because partial retirement is kind of an interesting status and we're still following the sample up. But we do see evidence here that not only were these partially retired adults less likely to decline on sense of purpose, but activity engagement may even matter more for this group. That this might be the group that when they start having more opportunities for activity engagement, so transcendence here is being kind of supportive of others and being able to do things kind of beyond the self or think about things beyond the self. Social activities, anything that kind of involves connections with others, cultural activities, going to museums and such, or cognitive activities being similar to the ones that I showed you earlier. Yeah, it seems to be the case that partial retirement may be a really interesting period for us moving beyond what interventions we can kind of do as a single laboratory. And we'll talk later about what this may mean for programs beyond any one research group. So the final piece of evidence that I want to point to is going back to that qualitative study. So again, we interviewed retirement community members about their purpose in life and what was going on in their retirement community. And when we asked them about support for goal-directed action, this is the category that pretty much more than anything else we saw evidence for. Nearly 3/4 of participants mentioned activity engagement as providing support for purposeful activity and that it was an essential element of their retirement community. So to give you an example, living here, there are so many activities that you can be a part of. It keeps me busy just looking after myself and being able to be a part of the community here. And that's a good part of keeping me interested in life. We saw a lot of narratives where the activities matter to retirees. And one thing that I want to point out is also the fact that one of the reasons we were in these retirement communities was the activity managers were asking us to come talk to the community members because they saw the evidence of activity engagement for retirees. So ultimately, that's kind of my best guess right now based on the empirical evidence of what is a potentially effective program for promoting sense of purpose among older adults. And what we need now is to start considering things beyond kind of activity engagement programs, and a few things that I want to mention. When we asked older adults about their perceived barriers to purposefulness, the top one mentioned was ailing health. And I think where this can lead us is first discussing how to engage individuals in purposeful activity that may not require a strong amount of physical functioning or be able to account for physical limitations. So this is one area of work that leads to some of the research being done by Burrow engineers and individuals trying to design these retirement communities to better engage individuals and to account for the potential declines in health. And finally, from this study, we need to consider the fact that retirement community experience is a really unique one, that it is something where a lot of individuals may be going there in part outside of their choice or their decision. And just like for any of the rest of us, it's a brand new environment with brand new people often, and you have to provide these kinds of scaffoldings to engage individuals in greater social connections. So this is something Tony and I recently wrote about in a commentary for helping individuals during the current pandemic in retirement communities, that we might need to be using more technology, using more opportunities to maintain connections between older adults when particularly it's difficult to adjust to a new environment or to adjust to the current context. The final thing that I'll do is kind of provide a pitch for a few broader policy initiatives, starting with new conceptions of what retirement means. And I think one thing that we are now having to wrestle with is the average age of retirement is now far earlier than the average life expectancy in a lot of countries. That perhaps it made more sense to think of retirement as a period in which you didn't want to start a new purpose or you didn't want to engage with purpose when retirement was closer to the average age for life expectancy. Instead, as an example, like from Switzerland, they have a mandatory retirement age that is now about 2 decades before the average life expectancy of adults there. So if you're thinking about 2 decades of life, it probably makes a lot more sense to be thinking about purpose and purposefulness and engaging individuals in this more forward-thinking, future-oriented thought. As Rachel's work shows, we need to be thinking more about opportunities to build new opportunities into society for a better transition process from work to retirement. This may be thinking about bridge retirement programs, partial retirement programs, but that stepping stone approach may be particularly valuable for helping to avoid the decline. And this is kind of a broader sales pitch more broadly, but we need to think about greater resources for retirement communities, in large part because of the idea that no one activity seems to be mattering more than others. If we're trying to promote a sense of purpose through activity engagement, we need to recognize that it's the case that retirees are going to find that purpose through lots of different means. And this is one of the things that the activity managers were telling us, that it's really tricky to try to build all of these programs when different people want different things. So just like the center, we now need to look ahead to where things are going from here. And some of the current projects that we are focused on is first thinking about what retirement planning means for sense of purpose. We've been doing a series of studies over the summer, both looking at financial retirement planning and general retirement planning to see whether purposeful adults are more likely to engage in this planning and what that may mean for a later sense of purpose. We're currently we've currently collected data and are analyzing it to consider the conceptions of a purposeful retirement. So what do people expect their retirement to be and why that may be important for understanding that transition process. And finally, ending with one of the things that I'm most excited about is we're doing a number of studies looking at what sense of purpose means in the context of chronic conditions and potential illness and injury. And one question that you may be thinking right now is, how do we get this? How do people maintain a sense of purpose in declining health, or how do people maintain a sense of purpose when potentially having issues? And what we've done now is first, we have a paper that we're revising right now showing that in older adulthood, even when you match people across all these different conditions, all these different variables that predict risk for injury, risk for major illness, the onset of illness, the onset of major conditions in older adulthood does not seem to predict a change in sense of purpose over time. That individuals who are experiencing these health ailments for the first time do not seem to be differing in their trajectories of purpose from other older adults who have not experienced it. And the final thing I'll point out is the fact that sense of purpose seems to matter to the same extent for predicting health and well-being for individuals with or without a chronic condition. So that all being said, I am going to first thank our funding agencies for helping us to do some of this work. And I would be remiss without saying that none of this gets done without the amazing people I've been able to work with over the years. A great set of graduate students, just a handful of people here for whom I could actually find pictures. Another wonderful group of professors that I've been able to work with over the years who have really influenced my thinking on all these fronts. And returning, of course, to the person who got me started in purpose in the first place, I want to thank Tony. This is actual advertisement from our very first ever Purpose grant. Tony got all the credit for the Purpose grant because he had a PhD and I didn't, and you needed to have that to submit it. But I guess 12 years later, I will stop holding that grudge because I think it worked out well for both of us. And just to show an equally embarrassing photo, I will say thanks to Tony and thank you all for your attendance today. And I'm happy to take some questions now.
Thank you so much, Pat. And the one thing I just realized we really miss here is the applause that I'm sure you'd be hearing right now. So just imagine it, okay?
Okay.
So just as a reminder to everybody, you can use the hands up, the raised hand function next to your name in the participants box, or you can write your question into Q&A. We do have a few questions, so while I'm looking for hand raises, I'll go ahead and with those. The first question from Karen Schantz is the decline in sense of purpose with age something you see across cultures?
So this is a really important question, and we're doing more cross-cultural work. So one of the studies that I showed linking changes in purpose to health, we've been trying to look at that effect in both now American samples and Japanese samples. We do, to the best that we can, we do tend to see a decline in other cultures, other contexts as well. But I will say that is very preliminary. I'm not sure how much to focus on that, given that most of the research that we've been able to do is because these studies in the States have included sense of purpose measures at multiple time points. And that's only now being done more in some of the large scale studies of aging in other parts of the world. So I guess I would say probably, maybe, but I don't have a great evidence to make a strong claim there.
Okay, thanks. Nancy Potter asks, how has SES and level of satisfaction with employment vis-a-vis life purpose been considered in your research?
Excellent question. So I'll take the second part of this first. We just published a paper recently among working adults, trying to see what kind of factors and what kind of aspects of the workplace predict which working adults felt an increased sense of purpose over time. And one of the few things that comes out is work satisfaction does seem to matter. And what I find is interesting is work satisfaction seemed to be more associated with sense of purpose than more objective indices of prestige or career status. So if you look at having a prestigious career versus a satisfying one, satisfaction seems to be more predictive, although it's not a huge association, I will say. When it comes to socioeconomic status, this is a really important thing for a couple reasons. So Tony and I have published a couple papers showing that purposeful adults tend to be more likely to increase their assets and financial status over time, which might be expected because they are kind of planning for the future. And we also find that countries where citizens report a greater sense of purpose tend to be those countries in which individuals are also, countries in which you also see higher economic growth, higher economic wealth. But what's interesting is a lot of our work is has been either controlling for socioeconomic status and showing that sense of purpose still matters above and beyond these variables. So it still matters for predicting health and well-being above a socioeconomic status. But also what I think is really telling is, some of the work we've been doing now with retirement planning suggests that, while sense of purpose may be linked to having a retirement account, having a retirement account wasn't necessarily predictive of change in sense of purpose over time. That a lot of the work that we've done shows that having greater wealth or greater socioeconomic status is not necessarily a need for leading a purposeful or directed life. It might be more likely to perhaps influence the ways or the different opportunities one has available to them to lead that directed life, but not necessarily be an impediment, I think.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask one more that came in Q&A, and then we have a hand raised. Edna Brown asks, what about statistics on older adults who don't live in retirement communities where engagement opportunities are more present, i.e. an older adult in a rural community with limited transportation and connection to activities?
This is an excellent question. That some of the work that I was doing in my previous position up in Canada was very focused on this because while we were housed in Ottawa, you don't have to go too far out of Ottawa to find some rather rural communities. There's quite a rural-urban divide across the country, and something that they were particularly interested in. And I think we have not really investigated that much about rural-urban divides or differences in sense of purpose. But I think this speaks to the need for greater resources towards providing more opportunities for individuals who may live further outside of the city. So the retirement community that we were specifically working with was one about, I don't know, 40, 50 kilometers outside of downtown. And they mentioned in their retirement community, there was a greater need for access, greater need for bus transportation in order to get individuals to the cultural activities that were available in downtown Ottawa. And I think this is a real concern that we would potentially expect for those individuals who maybe are guided by more cultural activities, are those who may need more transportation access. I think it's something that is, as the asker, as the person asking the question is raising, it's an important thing that we need to consider when thinking about intervention programs and how to divvy up resources across the state, across the county, particularly for those individuals who won't have access to these activities elsewhere or otherwise. So I don't have great data on that front, but I think the question itself is really important, again, when trying to plan these intervention programs, if I'm so focused on activity engagement as the route.
Okay, thank you. The next question can be asked directly by Al George. I'm going to allow you to speak now.
Okay, I'm unmuted, I think. So I'm a semi-retired member of a retirement community, Kendall, here in Ithaca. And but I loved your talk overall. In fact, I'd like to learn a lot more about it. And I'm very happy to see it's recorded because I'll just listen to it again. But my question is, I'm living in Kendall, which is a retirement community, and people there, well, obviously had enough money to go there. That's one socioeconomic group. And I'm curious, how about have your studies? What do they tell you about people who can't do that, live with their family, and because they have no other choice until perhaps they go in a nursing home where it's completely different atmosphere than one of these planned retirement communities. And how do they see things? What do they see as their purpose and where they're going? And what you said resonated tremendously with what I've observed in Kendall and in my life. But I'm curious how broadly how much of your work was outside of these planned retirement communities?
That's an excellent question. It's something that has come up a few times in the review, specifically for the paper I was mentioning on asking retirement community members about their sense of purpose, that we really had to specify, like, this is a private community that was a continuing care facility. And it may not be reflective of even other retirement communities or continuing care facilities. Thus far, the only thing that I can say to your point is most of that quantitative research that we've done, most of the individuals who were older adults in the health and retirement study were not necessarily living in that kind of community. So I can say that across the groups that we've looked at, a sense of purpose does seem to be predictive of important outcomes. But what we're doing right now is we have a study ongoing with members of the St. Louis community that we are specifically interested in the extent to which going into a cognitive care facility. So we have a great Alzheimer's research center here on campus, and we were interviewing older adults going in for that assessment, for that initial assessment, as well as their care partners, caretakers. And we gave them the exact same interview as we did for that community care facility up in Ottawa. And we're still coding through the data right now, but most of those people are not individuals who are in current facilities like that, several of which were living with their family in this kind of situation that you were suggesting. And what was really telling about the work that we've done thus far with those interviews is the fact that I think a lot of the time family members were kind of underestimating the level of purposefulness that the older adult felt. And this might be because they felt that the older adult target was in decline. It might have something to do with, you know, we are intentionally doing this in the context of a cognitive care facility. But I think what was telling for us was a lot of the older adults outside of the retirement care facilities, a lot of these older adults who were living either on their own or with their family, were reporting similar barriers in terms of declining health and so forth to feeling purposeful. But there's still a wealth of data there that we're still sifting through. So hopefully I'll have a better answer for your question in maybe a year or so. But as of yet, I can say that some of the barriers being mentioned for barriers to purposeful activity were very similar across those groups. And that's probably the best comparison that I can make at this time.
I just want to let everybody know it's about 1:07. I know a number of people have popped off. There's a few more questions, which I'll go ahead and answer or ask for Patrick.
You can answer
Pat,
too.
you should just know. That's okay. That's okay. You're the expert here. So I just want to let you know if people have to go, including the potential question askers, let me know. All right, Catherine Chain asks, how does the aging in place trend complicate the possibilities for interventions? There are movements like love living at home that could be used.
Yeah, that's a good, so we've been doing a lot of work here on campus about interventions here for helping be an age-friendly community on campus, and the aging in place discussion comes up quite a bit. And I think this is where we see the potential role of the engineering and design groups that are more focused on how to build environments. So I know that there's a group out at the University of Missouri that has been doing a lot of research on how to provide sensors in the home and such for indicating when individuals might be experiencing physical limitations or decline. For aging in place in particular, I think I would call upon some of the work that Tony and I have pointed to in retirement communities could be spread there as well. In terms of the aging in place initiative, probably needs more technology to promote social connections, social interactions. Our research with the Health and Retirement Study shows that these social connections are particularly important when it comes to maintaining a sense of purpose, and aging in place initiatives should really take into consideration how how to help individuals do that while still feeling a sense of connection to their community and family and so forth. So I think it's another, like, there's so many important initiatives, so many important groups where we're starting to recognize, again, just like retirement isn't a 0 or a 1, where people are ending up after retirement isn't a 0 or a 1, and we really are just scratching the surface on all the different initiatives and how we can play a role in promoting sense of purpose across these different projects.
Okay, Anthony Ong writes, thanks, Pat. I'm intrigued by the notion purpose involves having a sense of direction. This seems to me to be both the challenge and promise of purpose. Challenging because people may find it hard to articulate what, if any, direction their lives currently have. Promising because the real purpose, or the real power of purpose, it seems to me, is about our ability to imagine and turn what we imagine into a real choice, or about being proactive about creating those choices that enable you to go from who you are today to whom you want to be tomorrow. Question: do you see connections with the choice paralysis literature as being a backdoor into understanding how purpose in retirement can be honed by creating meaningful choices, ones that you can put ones that you can put yourself behind?
Yeah, so this is something we've been working, tangentially related, we've been working with some of the members of the public health school here. In terms of, they've been doing initiatives that have been going into communities and asking individuals to kind of identify what are the most valuable activities to them, what are the things about their lives that are more meaningful. And this might be one route to helping them make the choices that matter. And I think one question that this reminds me of is when I was at a conference, I guess it was before, just before all of this happened, somebody mentioned how close this seemed to be connected to some of the clinical interventions, the types of things that clinicians would do in settings to help people think through, like, what are the important aspects of your life? What are the most important details of your life? And plan your day around those. So I don't have anything directly related to, say, the choice paralysis literature, but I do think that a number of people have brought up the idea that helping individuals to figure out, what are those things that give me a sense that I am valued, a sense that I know what to do next. Those kinds of structured interviews may be particularly important for helping people make choices that ultimately lead them to feeling purposeful. And I know that there are models of purpose development that also speak to the idea of doing things aligned with what you think is appropriate or the common good in a given situation. And in reflecting upon that, after you've made that choice, if you reflect upon it and decide, yes, this was for the common good, it leads individuals to a greater sense of purposefulness. So in that respect, I think there are some important avenues to go on this choice literature. And it's really an aspect of purpose that's somewhat been understudied in terms of how purpose defines day-to-day selection, day-to-day choices and activities. And we recently have been looking at how people, how purposeful people expect to be that day, and that might be one entry point to understanding what are the decisions that are making and what are the choices they're making that day that either fulfill their purposeful expectation that day or perhaps lead them to feel less purposeful than they expected to be that day. So it's a great question. It's something that I agree is kind of the promise and the peril at the same time of trying to investigate how that sense of direction comes about through our day-to-day activities.
Right, thank you. And Elliot Smith writes, do you think that it's activity for activity's sake that is important, or might the activity need to be considered meaningful by the older person? By meaningful, I mean activity that contributes to things that are larger than the self.
So two parts to that. One, as I was just mentioning with the connections with our Brown School of Public Health, this is one area that we've been talking to them a lot about, is thinking through doing the activity that matters most to you. So meaningful activity engagement has been a central theme of the Public Health Center, and something that I think is an important avenue going forward. But aligned with that idea of the purpose development model I was just mentioning, some of our work has been looking at the different pathways people take to finding a purpose in life. And one of the primary pathways that I think is typically described as kind of the college student pathway of going out and proactively trying lots of things and seeing what fits, is actually something that we need to be promoting more in older adults and retirees as well. That this is an opportunity to try new things, to engage yourself in a lot of different possibilities, and then maybe have that self-reflection process. So I don't think that it has to be an activity that has broader implications beyond the self. That's kind of one aspect of definitions of purpose that it isn't necessarily the most well recognized. But I think it is something that if you can do the activity and then reflect upon it, and it gives you either a sense of purposefulness or a sense of completion, sense that you've done something aligned with your goals and your personal ambitions, that's where we're going to see that activity engagement matter more. And aligned with this question, this is another reason why there's no one activity that's mattering for everybody, and that none of these activities have held a particularly strong association with sense of purpose, insofar that there's no one panacea, one cure to purposelessness, and you might need to try a few different things to figure out what really clicks for you.
Okay, thanks. And then I hope you don't mind, but my question is kind of linked to what Elliot just asked. And I wonder if this isn't meant to mean it should supplant the idea of purpose as you're talking about it, but I do wonder if it interacts with it. So I asked, maybe it's normal for purpose to decline if sense of purpose is doing oriented and we are looking forward to ending life. Maybe the best way to assess purpose over the life course should be more about narrative coherence, spiritual connection to something broader than the self, sense of completion, readiness to confront the end of life. So I was wondering if there's an interaction in some way here with the doing aspects of day-to-day life that you're using and talking about purpose.
Yeah, that's a great point. So a couple things that we've been doing lately is, first off, so the work that my thesis student Rachel was doing used a measure that was not as focused on that kind of carrying out plans and carrying out activities. It was more focused in just being like engaged in non-trivial activities of day-to-day life, or being engaged with a sense of direction. And I think this might be one point that we need to consider with respect to which items are more important for capturing purposefulness at different points of the lifespan, that it may not be having the same level of completion of day-to-day tasks. It may not be focusing as much on carrying through with your plans that day, but more doing kind of non-trivial things, doing things that counter to those narratives that I was bringing up earlier, allow individuals to feel a desire to get up and engage with their lives. But more to your point, one thing that we're currently doing is my undergrads are working with a data set of St. Louis middle to older adults, in which we have asked them about the next chapter of their life. And to this idea of a narrative approach, rather than focusing solely on a self-report measure, what we're trying to do is see whether these themes that we as purpose researchers think are important are actually evident in the narratives without potentially people having to say, like, my purpose in life is this, or I have to have a clear direction for my lives. That if we can see themes of goal engagement, if we can read into themes of directionality, themes of life engagement with day-to-day life, this might be another way of trying to assess it beyond the self approach, which may be more valuable for capturing what it means in older adulthood. And the final thing that I would mention on the measurement front is our work with that retirement community up in Ottawa distinctly shows that there is a disconnect between the measures we use and the way people are thinking about purpose. That those retirement community members, again, I mentioned 44% of people were saying purpose is not for older adults, it's for younger people. I've kind of grown out of it. We still found that people were reporting moderate to high levels on that sense of purpose measure I started this talk off with. So what's interesting is we need to recognize that even when people are saying purpose in life is not for me, kind of back to that previous question, they can still feel a sense of direction, and like they still report this feeling that what they're doing matters or what they're doing is non-trivial. And I think this is something really interesting for both intervention programs as well as measurement, in terms of even when you get people saying purpose is not for older adults, they still score decently on the sense of purpose measure, which is telling us something about the need for new measurement and new ways of capturing what purpose means for older adults, which may be a narrative approach. It may be taking out items more focused on that kind of doing side of things. There are lots of different ways that we're starting to look into it with the recognition that, as I was showing, retirees are responding differently to those items.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, thank you, Pat, and thank you, everyone. And again, you have to visualize the clapping that I'm sure would be happening right now. You have to hear it. And I will just let everybody know that our next talk at 12 is October 29th, and Shauna Cooper will be here talking about fathers and parenting. So I invite you all to join us then. And Pat, thank you again so much for your important work and being willing to participate here.
Great, thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Pat.
Bye.